Hey everybody, I'm back and taking the place of Ty again. If you don't know, he had some unforeseen circumstances that he just needed to take care of. So as a team, here we are. I'm pulling it together and helping out, making sure we all make this happen. So if you aren't familiar with Rob Howard, I'm going to bring him on the screen because he's just too cool. There you go, Rob. So if you were a part of the previous session, then you heard Alicia talk about how to bring on a virtual assistant. And then Rob is going to talk about, well, I don't know exactly what you're going to talk about, but I do know you're going to talk about building a team. So you moved from that freelancer, I wear all the hats, I'm doing all the things, to I've built a team and they're doing maybe all the things I don't like to do, or maybe just all the things that keep me from doing what I do best. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. We're going to talk about transitioning from being kind of the sole maker on your team, right, where you're really doing everything, to being a manager of other makers, right? So I'll talk a bit, I'll probably overlap a bit with some of the VA stuff, but then I'll also talk about hiring creative professionals, coders, awesome. Salespeople, stuff like that.
Well, I love it because you're going to be talking from the perspective of a human that did it, right? And it is a tough transition, having only partially successfully done it myself, because I am one of those people that if I don't see it going smoothly, I pull it all back together and I just kind of take it on. So I'm really, really anxious to hear your talk. So I'm going to pull myself off. I know you have a presentation. Let's pull that presentation on, and I'm going to let you run with it.
All right, awesome. Welcome, everybody. My name is Rob, and today I'm going to talk about transitioning from maker to manager in your freelance business. Over the next 20, 30 minutes, what you're going to learn is how to think about growth starting from when you were a solo freelancer. So that was how I started, and I'm sure how most of you started out. Maybe you're a solo, maybe you're a 2 or 3 person team where you guys are all kind of equal partners in a business. So we're going to talk a lot about kind of what Emily just alluded to, is like, what is your mindset? What should your mindset be to really be successful with this? We're going to talk about how to hire. Obviously, there's lots of very inexpensive options out there. Should you use those? Should you go higher end? We'll talk about the pros and cons of each and maybe the different scenarios where each one would make sense. Then we're going to talk about what to do before you start delegating. We're going to talk last about how to be the best client you can be to your contractors, right? So this is actually a huge component of hiring that, not necessarily goes unnoticed, but I think is a lot more important than we give it credit for when we're just starting out. If you think about your best client and how fun it is to work for them, you want to make sure that you're creating an experience for your subcontractors that is equivalent to that and is really going to be, basically worth them setting aside other opportunities to work with you a ton. If you guys want, I'll show this at the end as well. You can go to go.howarddc.com/FBW. You will get a YouTube video of my presentation from a little over a year ago at the in-person Freelance Business Week Denver, which is all about creating retainers. And we'll talk a lot more about retainers and how they play into hiring in a little bit. You'll also get a 56-page PDF guide to hiring web developers, which, while it is very sort of narrow to web developers, there's also a lot of philosophy in that, and talks about how I grew my team and my experience hiring, and a lot of resources, and just a much more in-depth version of some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about today. So before I dive in, I'm just going to give a very brief kind of background on myself. I am the owner of Howard Development and Consulting. We are a web development and design firm. Primarily, we partner up with other creatives, right? So we do quite a few kind of full build projects now where we're doing design and development, but really, historically, I came into it because I had a background in design and advertising and journalism, and also in web development. So I sort of merged those two into a business where I was really helping designers and creatives with the communication and the implementation and execution of their web projects. I started out with this business back in 2009, but for the 10 years prior to that, I was doing all sorts of other freelancing. I owned other startups and design firms and stuff like that. And over the past 5 or so years, I've had the opportunity to grow from being really a solo freelancer with like a random subcontractor here and there, to having a large enough retainer sort of business and enough new projects coming in that I was able to expand and build a team. And I now have 14 employees, all in the U.S. and Canada, who are mostly full time and a few sort of flex part time. All web developers, designers, and project managers and writers. So that's been 5 years of transition, and basically what I'm going to talk about today is what that transition looked like for me, the lessons I learned, and the things that I think are going to save you guys all a lot of time and energy and frustration for when you want to scale up. So the big thing that everybody says when they start to get overwhelmed with their solo freelance business is, I wish I could just hire another me, right? Wouldn't it be cool if I could just sort of like clone myself and now we have 2 developers or 2 designers, and you can also do sales and you can also do all this stuff. And what I think is missing from this common sort of, feeling or that sort of outcry, right? When you're struggling with your own schedule and you're getting the good problem of having more clients than you can really handle, right? Is that you as an owner are always going to wear many hats, right? But the team that you're hiring really shouldn't have to. So when you think about hiring, I want you to think not about hiring another you or another copy of yourself, right? Because if you ask yourself, if somebody just like you showed up at your door and said they wanted to hire you, what would you say? You'd probably say no, right? Emily and I were just talking about being sort of unemployable in the sense that you want to run your own business, right? So there's a certain mindset there where hiring another you not only is not really feasible because it's kind of a rare mix to have all of these skills together in one place in one person, but you actually don't benefit much from bringing on that sort of partner and co-owner. What you really want to do is compartmentalize the tasks that you're doing on a regular basis and start to hire people who are really good at sort of confined or constrained things that are important to your business. So just as a basic example, if you're a creative web designer, web developer, writer, marketer, any of those things, most likely you do a bunch or all of the things that are on the screen right now. And I could probably go on much, much longer and make a much, much bigger list of all the things that you do. You don't want to hire somebody who needs to be amazing at all these things or even half these things, right? What you really want to think about is, how can I start to pluck off the low-hanging fruit here and sort of take some of these tasks out of my purview or supplement my work in some of these tasks. So for me, my primary business is web development, in other words, coding and programming of websites, right, and web applications. So when I started hiring for the first time, I actually went even a level down from this, and I said, I'm just going to hire people for front-end web development, right? I'm going to handle the back end myself, but by hiring someone to do the front end, that is going to allow me more free time, allow me to take on more projects more quickly. It's going to improve my workflow because front end usually comes first. So I can say, for example, well, I really want to start this project next week, but I'm personally booked for 2 weeks. But if my front end team can start on it, then the client will see that progress is being made. We can sort of say yes to that "can you start immediately" question. So as you think about this, I want you to think about the smallest possible chunks that you can break down your business into, and think about who could help you address those individual, very narrow areas. And when you do this, hiring and searching out those people who are going to help you actually becomes a lot easier, because you're not looking for that sort of jack of all trades or master of all trades type of person, right? As a freelance business owner, you're going to sort of naturally become good at all those things, but you don't want it to be a prerequisite that your team, whether they're contractors or employees, are good at everything. In fact, focus and specific subject matter or area expertise is going to be more valuable to you than having a bunch of entrepreneurs, right? It may be that everybody you hire kind of has their own business, but I think what you'll find is that a lot of people really don't like wearing many hats. So one of the benefits that you can offer them is, okay, you don't have to think about sales anymore. You can just code. You don't have to think about meetings anymore. You can just do copywriting, right? And that's going to benefit them as well as benefit you. So think about it in that sense of like, there's a win-win there, right? Somebody who doesn't want to be a salesperson, but still wants to sign a bunch of web development clients is going to be a great fit for somebody who doesn't really mind doing sales, but needs a lot of help with web development. And that was really the sort of bargain that I was making with my team as I was growing. I was saying, yeah, I see that you're freelancing, you're doing awesome stuff, but like, wouldn't it be cool if we could work together? I could do lots of sales and handle most of the client meetings and just feed you really good development projects. And that was actually a very attractive, sort of trade for the people who I was hiring. So you want to think about hiring people who are not exactly like you, in other words, who are not necessarily super into the wearing of many hats and would rather focus on just SEO or just copywriting or just video production or any of those things. Now, before we get into the hiring process, I also want to think about getting you ready to actually do this. So I'm going to show you basically 3 things to do before you start hiring anyone. The first thing that I want you to do first, and I would almost recommend spending like a week or 2 on each of these 3 areas before you even start thinking about anything else, right? The first thing I want you to do is eliminate unnecessary tasks. So as a wearer of many hats and a freelance business owner, you are most likely doing a million things. Hopefully you're kind of batching and managing your time in a way that's not driving you totally crazy. But even so, there's a lot going on that you are responsible for, and you're often kind of doing a million things at the same time, right? So the first thing I want you to do is kind of build out an inventory, maybe spend a week literally writing down a bullet point for everything you do during the course of that week or even the course of a month, right? And then I want you to aggressively think about the things that you could stop doing that wouldn't really matter to your clients, and maybe even make a goal of just eliminating like the 20% least interesting things or least valuable things that you're doing. To give you a few examples, I used to do a lot of busy work around like invoicing. So I would have a variety of thank you messages going out. Some people send like a Starbucks gift card with every invoice. Some people have elaborate invoice schedules that are different for everybody, right? What I did was I stopped doing some of those things, right? If you pay me an invoice, by check, you're going to get a thank you message. But if you pay online, I'm going to assume that you actually, see that credit card transaction going through and you can accept the thank you message that comes on there as a confirmation of your payment, right? So there's all sorts of little busy work things like that, in my opinion, are just not necessary and have to go at some point, right? Like when you start out, you're generally going to be very you're going to be paying very close attention to every detail of your business. You're going to want to kind of be hands-on with everything. But as you grow, elimination of some of these less valuable tasks, even if they are marginally valuable, if they're not, they really need to earn their way into your systems before you start delegating. Because if you delegate when you have a bunch of busy work, you're just going to be paying somebody to do a bunch of stuff that doesn't really matter to anybody, right? So you want to be really aggressive with getting rid of tasks before you bring on somebody to help you with your tasks. And this in and of itself is going to help you and I think help everybody on your team. But being really aggressive with elimination, reducing communication to a point where you're not sending a bunch of superfluous emails or messages, stuff like that is going to really be valuable to you. One other thing that I eliminated that was both a huge psychological bonus and also a good time savings is just basically not taking a ton of time responding to leads who were obviously not going to be a good fit, right? So obviously there's a certain level of like, you've got to be at a certain level to say, okay, I know this person's not a good fit. I'm not even going to bother really engaging with them. But now that we're getting lots of leads every week, honestly, there are some that I just don't reply to. And 5 or 10 years ago, that would have made me very nervous and guilty. But like, we've got a great business here. We know we're doing great work for great clients. Like, you don't have to spend 20 minutes or an hour engaging with every person who knocks on your door, especially if you can see that they're a better fit for somebody else, or there's just lots of red flags early on. So being sort of guarding your time, but also being aggressive about what you don't do is going to be really valuable here. You may also find that you actually want to eliminate certain types of projects. So for example, I do a lot of work with WordPress. 10 years ago, I was basically taking every similar system. Like if somebody wanted to work with Joomla or Drupal, those are comparable to WordPress, but very different in terms of the code itself. I would basically be taking everything, right? So elimination can also be saying, actually, I don't work with X platform and Y platform, or I don't do this type of project and that type of project, because it would require me to basically have a second or third like arm of my business just to handle those sort of semi-random requests that come in. So you can really niche down and eliminate some of the things that either are not as profitable or you just don't really want to do them and you'd rather focus a little more. So get creative with elimination. We can kind of talk in the Q&A about some more examples of that if you want as well. And then the next thing that I would like you to do before you delegate is automate as much as possible. Automation can have you can sort of take multiple angles on this, right? It's not necessarily get software to do everything for me, or it's certainly not hiring a robot to do everything for me. There can be situations where a software like Zapier or an API integration can just eliminate a thing that you used to have to do manually. Like for example, if you book a calendar event with me, you're going to go into my CRM automatically. No human being ever has to do that process ever again. So there's certainly value to automation in that sense. But the other thing that I want you to think about is, how can I create better systems that maybe a human is intervening with those, but it feels more automatic, right? So for example, one of the things that we've systematized quite a bit is proposals, right? If you get on a call with me, in fact, I was on a call 2 hours ago with somebody and he was saying, okay, we need this thing, we need this thing, and we need that thing. There's going to be X number of pages. We'd love for it to be in this amount of time, in terms of the calendar, schedule, stuff like that. And I was able to say, okay, great. And I'm literally plugging it into a spreadsheet that I've built that allows me to do a quick intake of what the project is going to look like, what my various different components are going to be. And it's basically a calculator in a spreadsheet, right? And it's saying, okay, this is now a $10,000 project, or this is a $3,000 project. So automation can be systematizing things that you're doing all day, every day. Even if you're still doing them, you might be able to reduce that time on a quote, for example, from an hour to 10 or 15 minutes. And that is going to dramatically open up the opportunity for you to just have more time, or for you to teach someone else how to do that process. So 5 years ago, if I tried to teach someone else how to do a quote, it would be an extremely elaborate process. I'd have to rely on their best judgment in a lot of ways that you might not be comfortable with, right? And basically, it's just a lot of us are just making things up as we go along with quotes and estimates. To be honest, right? Having a system, or a calculator in this case, automates that to such a degree that really it's a very simple intake process. Multiple people on my team can now do that sort of scoping and intake. And then we can look at the calculator's results together for 45 seconds and say, yeah, this looks good. Let's send out that estimate. So realize that the stuff that's going on in your head is not going to be easily translatable to your team unless you can break it down into a system that is, explainable in a few sentences, and hopefully automatable to some degree, so that you can, rely on things like a spreadsheet or a checklist to make that a lot easier. The other cool thing about this is that there have been many times where I've started to delegate something, and I've started this process of writing up an automation or elimination system, or really writing up an automation, right? What would I do to teach someone this who's never really done this before, right? And I've gotten like 3/4 of the way through automating it. And I've either said, this is so easy that I could just do it myself in 30 seconds, right? Or I've said, this is so simple and not that important that it actually doesn't need to be done. I can actually go back to elimination, right? So you'll often find that once you get through enough of this automation process, you'll actually be eliminating stuff that you thought you needed to automate, right? So all these things kind of play together into making your business a lot more efficient and making it a lot easier to bring people on into these kind of compartmentalized roles where, okay, now I'm going to hire a salesperson. Now I'm going to hire a web developer. Here's how you launch a site. Every web developer can now follow this process, right? So there's a lot of things that, this basically forces your mind to do, if that makes sense. The third thing I want you to do before you delegate anything is do it yourself. Now, this may seem sort of self-evident in that you are clearly doing some of these activities yourself right now. But one of the big temptations is I want to hire for something that is really an expansion of my company, right? So for example, if I'm a web developer who's never done anything with search engine optimization, I would not want to go out and hire an SEO expert the next day and expect them to be an integrated part of my team. That's really a situation where you really need to go out and hire a high-end consultant who is going to do everything for you and really be there to kind of hold your hand and communicate and potentially even communicate directly with the client. So that, to me, is not really a subcontractor relationship. It's more of a side-by-side contractor relationship where you're kind of co-contractor on a project because you both bring expertise that the other person does not really have. When you're thinking about hiring a team, what you really want to think about instead is, how can I hire people to do stuff that I'm already an expert at, right? So you should really be thinking about starting after you eliminate and after you automate. Pick the things where you can realistically train that person to be fantastic at that job. You're not relying on them to go out and gain their own expertise, right? You're expecting them to come in with a decent amount of knowledge, but then you'll be responsible for at least some of the training and planning and structuring of the work that they're going to do. And that's really the sweet spot, because you don't need to go super high end, like the example I just gave, where you need a separate consultant. You don't want to go super low end, where you're paying somebody, $3 or $5 an hour. That basically never works out well for anybody. But it allows you to sort of be in the middle where you're saying, okay, maybe I have a little bit more experience than you, but you still have this core body of knowledge that you're going to need to be a web developer or to be a web designer and fit into the systems that I've created. And then when you provide something, I can actually give you real feedback. I might be able to help you with stuff or train you in stuff or kind of, brainstorm with you in a way that I, as the business owner, remain the leader of this project, but you are good enough at this to clearly take a substantial amount of work off my plate, and I'm good enough at it to guide you to the finish line, right? This is really where the sweet spot is for serious hiring and delegation, because it allows you to kind of get the best of both worlds, right? You're making what is essentially a win-win deal with the team member that you're adding. You're saying, hey, I'm going to handle all the stuff you don't want to handle with the many hats, right? I'm going to give you a project that I know you can save me a lot of time on. And then I'm going to give you guidance to get you from 80% to 100%, right? That is really where the sweet spot is, where this is profitable for you, where you're saving both time and money on the process, right? We all have stories where we said, like, well, I hired this person, but like I basically spend the same amount of time telling them what to do that I would have spent doing it myself, right? So we're trying to avoid that type of scenario and instead find these sort of sweet spot scenarios where you're hiring somebody who is good enough to save you a ton of time while also at an earlier stage in their career than you, so that you can really give them guidance and teach them stuff. And the combination of all those factors together means faster, better outcome for your client, and it's profitable for you. All right, I want to talk a little bit about where to find great people. So typically, you're going to start off hiring independent contractors. You may eventually, as I have, transition to either making your contractors into employees or hiring employees directly, either part-time or full-time. So most of these can work both ways. I'll just do a quick kind of rundown of these. And if you want a much more detailed look at the options here, you can grab the bonus guide. And I'll give you the URL again at the end. And I talk about, maybe a dozen or more of these in there in a lot more detail. So one easy area to start is local groups and meetups. In Denver, we have one called Better Together. There's dozens of others. There's a Denver web developers group that's on Slack that you can, join and even post jobs in there if you wanted to. You guys are all already networking, so use those networking groups as a place to find subcontractors to start out. Particularly people who are earlier on in their career are going to be great opportunities where you can kind of, basically, make that kind of positive trade that I've been talking about. The one thing I would add here is I do not recommend hiring people who are also your friends in your personal life. Sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't, but I prefer to keep those things separate. Even though I consider everybody that I work with a friend, I'm not hiring them out of my personal life into my business life, if that makes sense. The next tier are marketplaces. So Upwork is one that you probably all know. TopTal is a little bit less well-known, but also a very valuable resource. TopTal is going to be a little bit on the more expensive side. Upwork, you can find a pretty wide range. I encourage you to use the higher end of people on Upwork in terms of pricing because you're just going to get better quality and better service in general. Upwork and TopTal both have various types of restrictions on when and how you can take someone out of the system. So just be aware of that. They're going to basically try to charge you a fee to pay somebody outside of Upwork or TopTal. I've done that and it's worth it for me because it's basically a recruiting fee, but just be aware that there are some restrictions on those platforms for better and worse. And the third bullet here is basically job posting sites. LinkedIn, AngelList, Indeed are just three of many. I have used these successfully as well. And it really, I think, they probably are a little better if you're doing a part-time hire or a full-time hire, but I would encourage you to experiment with all of them because you just never know when you're going to find, when and where you're going to find that right person. The negative is that on Upwork and TopTal, you actually, what I should say is the benefit of Upwork and TopTal is you really can kind of like get a curated list in a slightly different way than waiting for people to give you job applications on these other sites. But I would encourage experimenting with both. And then another really valuable set of resources that I have two examples of here are specialized hiring platforms. These are often around diversity and inclusion initiatives. There's also some that are, just specialty for a certain type of software, specialty for a certain type of task, right? These are two examples that I've used with success and really, have loved the results of. But there's a lot out there, and not only are they often great from a social justice standpoint and an equity standpoint, but they're also places where there's just a ton of fantastic candidates who are going to be excited to get on board with a great growing business. The last point here is that as you think about this, I don't want to put too much pressure on you, but I also do want you to be cognizant of the fact that your early hires really matter a lot for the trajectory of your business, which means you should be thinking about who do I want in terms of mindset, in terms of location, in terms of their approach to the business, in terms of diversity and inclusion, in terms of all these things. How do I want to seed my business with my first 3 or 5 or 10 employees or contractors? Because as you grow, and if you're fortunate enough to grow beyond that, what you're going to see is a network effect. People are going to see who's working for you, and they're going to say, oh, this is a certain type of company who hires a certain type of person, and I'm that type of person, right? So you want, not only to think a lot about the sort of quality and logistics of it, but you also want to say, okay, I'm very deliberately building a team here. Who do I want to be on that team? What types of team members do I want to have in terms of their approach to the business, in terms of their life experiences and all those other things. So what's really hard is when companies have already hired 25 people, right? And then they feel stuck in sort of a rut or a pigeonholed situation with their team. So you want to sort of get out ahead of that and say, hey, if I'm going to grow, I want to grow. I want to set myself up for positive growth in the right way. The last thing I'll talk about before we go to some Q&A is how to be everyone's best client, right? So as we've discussed a little bit already, you're a freelancer because you've sort of eschewed employment and work to some degree in the past, right? So when you think about who you want to work with, you probably have a really good profile in your head of who are my best clients and why, right? I want you to ensure that the experience you're creating for your contractors reflects what you know about your best clients so that you can be their best client as well. What this is going to do is not only just provide everybody with a better and happier life from day to day, but it's also going to mean that your contractors are going to stick with you, maybe even become employees someday, because they're going to see the value in the partnership, right? The hardest thing to do is hire for the same position over and over again because people keep quitting or finding better opportunities, right? So you really want to think about retention as one of the biggest and most important elements of growing your business. In other words, I would it's hard to really quantify this, but there are probably hundreds of thousands of dollars at stake between replacing someone every year versus keeping the same person on your team for 5 or 10 years. There's just so much more efficiency and growth available, not to mention just the time that it takes you to recruit, but also the time it takes you to train, the time it takes for all that institutional knowledge to be transferred. So having somebody who sticks with you for a long time is a huge, huge hidden benefit and something that you should really, really be focusing on in your initial, thinking about hiring and growth. One element of that is retainers. If you have retainers, you can put your contractors on retainers, which means they'll stick around. They'll know that you're basically a sure thing, right? From a business and payment and longevity standpoint. Again, I've got a whole other workshop on that that you can download for free afterwards. I'll give you that URL in a minute. One of my favorite things that's super easy to do is pay people fast. I pay my contractors on a credit card. There's like a $30,000 limit on that credit card, which means I'm paying you the day you get that invoice. And no one asks for that, but it is such a huge benefit and bonus for everybody just to know, like, I don't have to think about this. I never have to bug Rob because he's, net 60 on an invoice that should have been net 30, right? So obtaining enough, basic credit to just pay everybody immediately is actually going to be a huge benefit in terms of your team building process. Obviously, another component of that is paying well. So we try to pay significantly above like market medians for everything. Most of my team, is pegged to somewhere around the 90th percentile for like a Denver web developer or a Denver web designer. And I keep my prices at a place where that's still profitable for me as a business owner. And I want to be able to credibly say, like, there's no better place to work than here for the following reasons. Obviously, I'm not cramming that down people's throats, but I want to present that in a way that is, pretty reasonable and indisputable. Like, yeah, we're doing a good thing here. We're not skimping. We're not, trying to go cheap on anybody. The fourth thing here is this is not an invitation or permission for you to like stop working once you hire people. Obviously, you want work to become more efficient over time, but you're not like going to the beach and putting your feet up, right? Like, I'm hoping someday in the future I will go to the beach again after being home for a really long time, but that is an aberration and not the norm, right? You want to avoid sort of that 4-hour work week, fake entrepreneur mindset, because that is not really a real thing. It is very much like a weird fantasy. I certainly encourage everybody to take copious, healthy vacations, but this is not about offloading all of your work to someone else and automating yourself completely out of your business. In fact, the last bullet here is that what will happen is, rather than automating yourself out of your business, your job is actually going to change. You're going to become more about as you're going to become more of an architect of your team and a protector of your team. In fact, what I actually have found that I enjoy doing is really building healthy work environments for the people around me. So part of that is I'm running interference on clients who are being rude or not establishing those same healthy work environments. Part of that is, setting up systems that are conducive to a healthy work environment. And part of it is just communicating to my team, like, please stop working at night. Please don't work on the weekend unless you are taking Monday and Tuesday off, right? Stuff like that. And just making sure that they understand that this is a business that is supposed to be conducive to a great lifestyle. We're not here to overwork you. We're not here to squeeze every dollar out of you. We're here to create really good, healthy, long-term relationships that allow everybody in the experience to prosper for a long period of time, and hopefully allow us to work together for many, many years in a way that is fun and profitable for everybody. Again, if you want to hop on to this go.howarddc.com/FBW URL, you will get a bunch of free stuff by signing up there. And I will open it up to questions and Q&A. Emily, if you want to kind of lead me down the Q&A road and kind of, let everybody know what to do there.
I am happy to. So thank you so very much. Actually, yes, I'll keep an eye on the, usually the Q&A stuff usually happens right about the time I'm ready to say, okay, let's finish. Rather, it takes a while for the system itself to push it over. I'm not quite sure, but I'll keep an eye on that. But I actually took a few notes. So, and I think you actually answered this question, but at the very beginning you talked about you had 14 employees. So those are employees, W-2s, not contractors.
Correct. So in the past year, we've transitioned people from being, basically part-time contractors to part or full-time employees. And that was a decision that I made a little bit earlier than it probably was like absolutely necessary from like a legal compliance standpoint. But
Okay.
the reasoning was that people had been growing into a larger and larger amount of time with working for me as their main client, right? So even if they had one or two other clients, people who are doing 30 or 40 hours per week for my company, theoretically could be contractors, but really it makes more sense to treat them as employees from a legal standpoint. I also found that, when we got bigger, there were health insurance benefits that became available to us. There were things like wanting to give people a better structure around when they should take time off, right? So as a contractor, the instinct is like, well, there is no such thing as paid time off, so I should just work 2,080 hours per year, right? Precisely, right? So some of it was psychological because I wanted to provide just a more structured work environment. Some of it was logistical in the sense that, like, we had a few contractors who lost some clients during the pandemic for reasons that were totally out of their control, like the businesses went out of business. Right. And we were fortunate enough to have work for them, so they went from being 20 hours a week to 40 hours a week, right? So that was a transition that I made kind of in that context. It's definitely something that I would say, like, don't even think about for like 5 years if you're hiring your first contractor today. There's a lot of flexibility there, but you don't want to abuse that flexibility. And if somebody is like clearly inching toward employee, I've actually found that it's a lot easier than you'd think. There's a lot of companies out there that do basically what's called like co-employment or a PEO, which makes it a lot easier. So I'm using those types of companies, and there's some paperwork, but honestly, when you have as many people as I do, it is actually beneficial to everybody to do employment. Whereas if I'm just hiring one or two people, I still might want to have them on a 10-hour-a-week retainer because that's going to benefit everybody, but they're clearly, a contractor who has other clients and is not working directly for me.
All right. Yeah. So that was actually moving into my next question was keeping up, making sure that you have enough time. When you have a direct employee, you kind of have to identify how many hours is it going to be full-time, part-time, and then making sure you have enough hours to keep those people in place. So you're not necessarily having to address that. Is that correct?
Exactly. So actually, it's interesting because one of the great things about contractors is they are more flexible, right? Like obviously an employee can get their hours cut or get laid off, but that's a much more emotional situation than a contractor.
Yeah.
However, one of the things that I really liked when I hired via TopTal was that they actually forced a 20-hour per week contract on you. So obviously there's negatives to that, but the positive from a psychology standpoint was, okay, I can't like go halfway with this, right? Like I actually need to kind of go all in on hiring somebody and actually give them stuff to do. And what I was doing previously was I would kind of dip my toes in it and I'd be like, oh, this isn't saving me time, I'm going to stop doing this. But I never really gave hiring a good contractor enough of a chance, right, in the past. So one of the big mindset shifts that I made was, rather than just dipping your toes in it, when you think about that list of tasks that you're going to create for yourself, the psychology that I would use is, in a year, I'm never going to write code again. Or in a year, I'm never going to do bookkeeping again, right? So if you think about that, it really forces you to delegate in a different way, because there is not this scenario where, oh, well, I'm going to delegate 20% of this. It's no, you need to either go all or nothing, define a task that you're never going to do again, right? So like bookkeeping was an easy one. Web development was a harder one, right? But eventually I got to the point where I don't code anymore, and I'm a coder, but I don't code, right? So I run my business, and my team takes projects and gets them done, right? So when you think about it that way, it forces you to almost like kind of take sort of the cliff's edge approach a little bit more, and basically say like, I'm not gonna kind of go halfway with this. I'm gonna choose something that in a year will not be my job anymore, right? And that's gonna be a nice, just sort of psychological way to push yourself a little bit harder.
I'm actually curious. Did you read The One Thing? Have you read that book?
I don't think I think I've heard of it, but I don't think I've read it.
It's a great book. You probably don't need to read it anymore, but who knows? You may still like it. But one of the things that I loved about the book is they pose a question, and I'm probably going to slaughter it to some degree, but I think you're supposed to ask it once a day. What is the one thing I could do right now or today that would make everything else I do irrelevant or easier?
Yeah.
And that's kind of a cool question. Like with everything that I'm doing, I do the freelance conference, freelance business week, obviously. And so this year, I can't take credit for it, but one of the people on my team came forward and said, hey, I'm a kick-ass project manager and you're not. So could I step in and help you out here, because you're losing your mind? And it turns out that was amazing. Sometimes you don't know what it is you need. And so I was kind of curious if you've ever been in that spot where it's like, okay, I get that I need help, but I may not even know exactly where I need the best help right now.
And you know what really helped me with that is like doing like those personality tests, right? So like, for example, I'm an ENTP, right? Which means I'm good at big picture thinking, right? I'm very extroverted, so I'm pretty good at sales, stuff like that. But I really struggle with finishing the last like 10 or 20% of a project, right? Where you have to do all the detail work, right? So, there's obviously you can do like the big 5 personality tests, you can do the Myers-Briggs, and they all have various, flaws and pros and cons to them. But I think they're interesting in a big picture sense, because I know that even though I'm a coder, I actually am not your typical coder, because I'm extroverted rather than introverted, and I'm actually not super detail oriented. I'm kind of like a messy inventor type of personality.
I can get that.
So having team members who complement me in those areas, where I can just say like, I'm not going to do this thing. Like, you guys take this client, to-do list and process it and get it done, and they're comfortable with that because they are sort of the inverse of me, right? And that's sort of the complementary system where like I can be great at, sales and marketing for, reasons that are basically results of my temperament and things that I've enjoyed practicing over the years.
Right.
I theoretically good at the last final checklists, but it's labor for me, right? Like, and for other people, it's like, oh, that's actually what I like to do. I like to just sit down and rock out, the last bit of that project, So I think you'll sort of grow into that, and that sort of elimination, automation, and do-it-yourself practice is actually going to help you define that. But as you grow your team, you'll find that there are certain members of your team who are just going to be naturally attuned to certain parts of any project. And basically we can kind of, strike that correct balance between different team members, if that makes sense.
So one of the questions that we got is, hi Rob, great presentation, and they're absolutely right. It is a great presentation. Do you have any tips on vetting potential people? Do you rely on references, etc.? There are so many things to consider.
Yes. So I write a lot about this in the guide that is available as a PDF, but I will give you the short version of it, which is I don't really care about references at all. I don't even really care about resumes at all. What I rely on is test projects, right? So what I do is I do an intro sort of Zoom meeting, which is basically an informal interview, right? Basically, I have, 4 or 5 key questions just to sort of quiz you to make sure that like you've done this before, like with WordPress, like have you ever built a custom plugin? Have you ever built a custom theme? Do you know what an API is? Stuff like that, just to make sure that like you're communicating well with me. You're clearly showing that there's some domain expertise there. Honestly, a lot of people just eliminate themselves by not even showing up to the Zoom meeting, which you would be is surprising but true.
It is surprising. Yes.
So once you get somebody who, I want to make sure that they are, a good communicator, able to kind of do some basic stuff like respond to emails and keep a meeting and stuff like that. Obviously, if somebody legitimately has to like take their kid to the doctor, that's a different story. But if somebody just like ghosts the meeting, that's usually not worth following up on, right? Yeah. And then once I've validated that, you're basically going to be a fit in terms of like you're enthusiastic about this and you have enough knowledge that I can sort of teach you and train you on the rest as needed. What I actually do is I offer people a paid test project, and I say, okay, we have PSD, Photoshop document. We want you to turn it into the homepage of this website. It usually takes people about 10 to 20 hours. We'll pay you $50 an hour to do this. Would you like to do it? And everybody says yes, but then you have another layer of people who just never do the test project, right? For various reasons, even though they're getting paid for it. And then you have a layer of people who do it, but there's just some obvious concerns with it. And then you have a layer of people who did a great job on it. And you can kind of tell like the degree to which they're enthusiastic, the degree to which they are asking good questions. I don't necessarily need it to be perfect, but I want to see like some real life, skills about asking good questions and solving problems by yourself. Sometimes I'll leave a few Easter eggs in there and I'll say like, most people ask about this font. And if you ask about that font, I'm noticing that you're noticing stuff, right? And all that kind of thing. So it does cost money, but I find that spending, $1,000 on a test project in order to validate that somebody is really solid before they touch my actual client work is 100% worth it for me.
It's a good investment. I actually had a colleague years ago out of Arizona that she would do the same thing. She hired a lot of writers, and so she would hire 5 writers at a time to write the same piece of content.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And then narrow that down to 3, and then she would go through 2 rounds. So that makes sense.
Yeah.
So we have another question is, can you speak to how you coordinate and maintain quality work among a geographically dispersed team of specialists, i.e. like designers, developers, etc.?
Yeah, so great question. I think, the number one thing is that most of us who are on my team are used to working from home already. So we actually, in many ways, we did not struggle with the change of everyone working from home, right? It was actually more like evening the playing field for us. So, most freelancers today, I think, are going to have a decent amount of experience with home office life and like are going to be on the point where they're like getting distracted by Facebook and Netflix all day, right? So what we do is a couple of different things. We really strive to be as asynchronous as possible. So what we will do is weekly meetings for certain clients where that meeting always takes place at the same time and it's on everybody's calendar and we've all like prearranged it, right? So that is really superior to the client being like, hey, can we hop on a call? Because like maybe I'm in
the middle of something.
I'm in New York and you're in LA, or I have to go pick up my kid at 3 o'clock, but you just started your day at that time because you're in a different time zone, like all these things, right? Yeah. So having established weekly or every 2 weeks meetings with big clients is a great way to take some of that time zone challenge off your plate, We use Basecamp, which has sort of like chats and to-dos all built in. It's, equivalent to Slack in many ways. But, really trying to be asynchronous in the sense of like, I want person A to be able to line up a list for person B, and they should not really have to like hop on a quick call to talk about it because it should be well defined in advance. The last thing that I'll mention is we use Loom for video recording all the time.
I do too. I love it.
Because you can say, okay, now here is a visual. Here's me talking about it, but I can do a 7-minute Loom video, and it doesn't matter if that employee is here right now or if she's going to be coming on tomorrow or later tonight or whatever. We have
or
team members who,
and
we have
to
people
go back.
who intentionally work off hours because that's how they want to structure their lives around their families or whatever other needs they have, right? So they're not all working 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Yeah. And I want to really build an environment that is conducive to that. So the one thing I will say is that we're all within 4 time zones, basically East Coast to West Coast, North America. So the vast majority of our clients are also in North America. So, that's an area where we're not dealing with, people who are in Australia or India, or, Asian time zones that are just way, way off. But, for us, being able to connect for at least a couple hours in the middle of the day where everybody's online and then letting everybody go do their own thing has been, those are the ways that we've accomplished that.
Yeah, I could see that. And I wonder if some of that question, and you guys can give us some more detail if you want to, was directed towards, if you have people on the other side of the country, and you're 12 hours off and it can be kind of crazy and hard to pull your team together. And so it's almost, for me, my thought was, because I've used some, used some people before that were on, the other side of the world. And one of the things that I did like about it is I could do my work all day long and basically set up for, okay, here's what I'm going to push off, and then push off all the detail, make Loom videos, so on and so forth, and then wake up tomorrow morning and go through the next process.
Yeah. And I think the big picture concept is, you should never be a bottleneck for your team, right? So you need to set yourself up to make sure that you're okay with getting asked a question about this, and like you're freeing those bottlenecks as soon as they come up, right? Because the worst thing is your contractor sitting around waiting for you for 2 days, right? That's a negative experience for everybody.
Yeah. Even if you were, think of yourself, I guess, as the manager, even in a larger company, is your job is to clear the path for all the people that are working underneath you to do their job. Yeah. So what made you decide to go employee versus continuing to use contractors?
Yeah, so I touched on this a little bit, but I think, the big thing was wanting to get ahead of it, right? Because everybody hates like the Uber contractor abuse narrative, right?
Yeah.
I'm not doing that because we have very high-end contractors. Everybody on the team would basically be fine with getting paid as an independent contractor forever. Yeah. But what I have learned is that the more hiring I do, also the more legitimate that I want to look everybody else. And I think when you get to 14, it's starting to look a little fishy, right? It's not fishy from a legal compliance standpoint, but it definitely is a place where I can offer more benefits to my team. I think it's actually going to end up being a little bit cheaper for the company to do employees because we're at this scale now. But the other stuff that we do is we have equal pay policies. So everybody who's doing the same job role gets paid the exact same amount. We have profit sharing policies that are based on a transparent formula. So as I've gotten into more of those things, it's made less sense to keep everybody as a contractor. It's made more sense to do employees. Not every employee works 40 hours a week. Not every employee is full-time, but they're all treated as, sort of legal employees in a different way.
So this person is asking you to speak to defining the culture, and it really kind of blends in with what you were just talking about, having the conversations once a week and things like that. So defining the culture, a work structure, and of course you can read it, but meaning if you don't build it, everyone else will build it for you.
Yeah, and I think people also are going to look to you for examples, regardless of whether you're giving those examples intentionally or not, right?
Yes.
So if you're running around like crazy and always telling everybody how busy and stressed out you are, that example that you're setting, intentionally or not, is going to trickle down to your team. The way that I like to look at it is, it would be very difficult for a company to hire me right now, because I don't see that there's a lot of companies out there who have established a culture that I would want to be a part of, right? There's
Sure.
lots of issues in tech across the board, but overwork is a huge issue. There's a lot of tech companies where there's an assumption you're going to work 50 or 60 hours a week, and you're going to get kind of, looked down upon if you don't, right? There's tons of issues with gender and racial diversity in tech. There's all these things that are turnoffs to me, because I'm basically very picky about who I would want to work with and for, right? So I take that same philosophy and apply it. Instead of going up, I go sort of down the ladder with that philosophy, and I say, okay, how would I build a company that I would want to work for, regardless of whether I was the owner or an entry-level team member, right? And those are the questions that are kind of challenging, but that I have asked myself to try to shape this business in a way that makes me, proud of it, but also I think makes it attractive to great people to come and join. So a lot of that is being more democratic in all of our decision making. It's profit sharing. It's equal transparent pay. It's systematizing things like promotions so that you can't really be subject to like the whim of your manager in the same way that you are at the typical company. There's many more hours that I could talk about all that as a different presentation, and will someday. But those are all things that I'm thinking about. But basically, the sort of resolution that I made is like, if I'm going to do this and grow, I'm going to build a company that I would want to work for, and that building a great company has actually become my job, as opposed to like delivering websites, if that makes sense.
It does, yes. So that was the end of, there may be a couple of that trickle in, and we're just at the end of our hour. Man, this was really amazing. We have a little Teams chat of all the organizers, and there's a couple of people that have been like, oh, no, my goodness, this is so good. Because there's a lot of people that, like we talked about in the very beginning, maybe even before we went live, it's all getting a little blurry already, but how difficult it can be to make that transition. And
totally.
So thanks for the inspiration that it can be done, and some guidelines of how to move forward. I love the Zapier piece, being a person that loves to automate tasks. That was a good one. Yes,
automate and eliminate as much as you can, and then you'll have really good stuff to give to your team members so they can enjoy their work and enjoy working for you.
Yes. So if anybody else needs to get a hold of Rob, his URL to his website is right beside this post on the Hey Summit website. And other than that, thank you again so much. He's got the URL that he gave you earlier on how to get his download. And this will be available on replay for everybody that has the premium ticket. Again, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, guys. So we have a couple things left to just chat about real quick. If you have more questions, you're welcome to put them in there, and we will get them over to Rob as they come through. And the next up is Vernie Hatch, where she's going to talk about knowing your numbers. We're super excited about that conversation. It's a big one. And I think every freelancer needs to have it. And then from there, we're going to talk about why you need or don't need a website. And then from there, we have our networking event. I hope you guys will join us for that in Topia. So again, thank you so much for your time, and I'm going to let you go so you can go to your next session. Bye.